want to know something about economics, talk to John. If you want to get into an argument, talk to John. If you expect to win an argument, don't talk to John. I didn't know what to expect. Threw it out there less than 2 weeks ago. It probably helps that we've got a good guest speaker here tonight. Some of you know Dan Ryan. Dan's a corporate lawyer. He was there for 15 years, I think, to Dan to talk about Hong Kong.
Well, thanks very much, Graham, for the kind introduction. It's good to be here. It's good to talk to you about it. There's been a lot of interest, obviously, in Hong Kong in the last 3 months. I've given a lot of thought to it, and one of the things that occurred to me in the last couple of days was a passage that the Conservative columnist Peter Hitchens wrote in a book of his about how, when he was a foreign reporter, and I think it was Somalia, he witnessed a scene where there were policemen with white gloves directing traffic, and was very civilised when he was there. And then he came back 10 years afterwards, and suddenly it completely deteriorated. The social fabric had broken down. And he said that once you've seen something like that, you never look at your society in the same way again. And I reckon for weeks the MTR has been at the centre of the protests that have gone on. They've enabled really what has happened, the tactical hit and run of the protesters with very sophisticated social media technology, which I think actually will be quite influential globally, for good and for bad protesters, depending on perspective, and the way they implement things. The tactics will be adopted. But anyway, you've got to so I asked myself, you know, how does this happen? How does this civil order break down? Is it salvageable in Hong Kong? And what does it all mean? And one of the things I think that probably hasn't been covered as well or understood as well in the public is that, and this is something I actually was discussing this afternoon on the ABC, it's that it's not only is it not like 1989 in Beijing, it's actually, I think, should be understood much more the process of Hong Kong as a type of the populist movements that have broken out in the United States, famously with Trump's election, with Brexit, Eastern Europe, and the rest of it. In this sense, the protests, in my view, aren't driven so much by a desire for freedom, but a desire for the preservation of a particular identity. So it's not a Reagan-esque type of revolution where the Eastern Europeans are throwing out Soviet rule, or Beijing in 1989, where there was genuine, repression, and people wanted greater freedom. That was what motivated them. In Hong Kong, in my analysis at least, it's much more to do with, it's a Trumpian-style revolution in this sense, a Trumpian uprising, in that people want to make sure they preserve the ethnic or identity of Hong Kong. They want to protect their economic stability and livelihood from direct competition from mainland China, and they want to also, at some level, maintain the sovereignty, control over their own over their own lives. And I think it's worth thinking about this because that's a microcosm for, Hong Kong exists cheek by jowl with mainland China, and they're directly exposed to mainland China in economic terms because they're broadly, they're ethnic, Chinese racially, I suppose you'd describe them as. There's a different language, as mutually unintelligible as Gaelic and English, but sharing the same characters, although even then there's structural differences at times. So bottom line, that's ultimately what I think has been driving it. And the other thing that has been, the importance needs to be stressed is that it's partly to do with the dysfunctional way that Hong Kong has been set up. There have been, this isn't the first protest that has occurred since 1997 with the handover, and there were protests before that as well under the British. But the way Hong Kong is set up, you have the Legislative Council, which is effectively like a mini parliament, and then you have the Chief Executive, who is the notionally the chief of the executive. And a third of the Legislative Council are elected more or less directly, a third are appointed by Beijing, and a third are, in simplified terms, members of sort of industry guilds. So you have, if you imagine the equivalent of Queensland being, I don't know, a third of Brisbane being, of Queensland state MPs being appointed by Canberra, a third being appointed, you know, the chairman of the ABC being elected, the head of the Real Estate Association, God knows what else, you know, maybe think tank head might be in there as well. And then you know, so you have a situation where controversial issues arise, whether it's implementing sort of new security laws, as happened under Tong Chi Hua, you know, and this was 2003, right, where there was there's all these things, there's a reasonable argument to make. I mean, it's 2003, Patriot Act was being introduced in the United States. In Australia, we were introducing, you know, greater security, national security related laws. But because they can't go to the electorate and say, this is what the program we're going to implement, please back us, they never get a genuine democratic mandate. And so, you know, with all the different controversies and policies that arise in any society, you know, carbon taxes, stop the boats, all the rest of it that dominates the headlines, unless you can kind of flush that out through an election of some sort, it never clears. And doesn't mean you don't have to you know, accept or agree that 50% of the population have it right, but at least it means that the executive can act and make an argument that, look, I've got the people with me on this one. The reason why this thing is so well covered is because you've got the headquarters of the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong, you've got a massive Cantonese and English press. The reason, far more so than a place like Singapore, where the Wall Street Journal can't operate because they're sued, and you know, Singapore is less, you know, arguably less democratic than Hong Kong in some ways, but for reasons that I was explaining earlier, at least those guys, they are their own little city-state, they're autonomous, they have their own sovereignty, the society comes in, and they're also not directly in direct competition with, you know, the Indonesians and Malaysians around them. It's not quite, haven't quite experienced the brutal gales of competition in the way that Hong Kong people have. You know, the mainlanders who used to be these country bumpkins have now, you know, become very English-speaking, highly skilled. They come down, they're buying real estate, they're buying, competing directly for business opportunities in the professional services sphere, and in a whole lot of other spheres. And if you're a blue-collar worker as well, you've got sort of, you know, you've seen a lot of stuff being outsourced across the border. So there's just this pressures that be put on that unique city-state. And
as it happens, was in Hong Kong over the weekend. I'd actually gone over to do some recording for Hugh because he wrote a very interesting book back in 1964 and 65. And my experiences were that it was an incredibly well-managed protest. I was wandering around the city and you'd see in the distance the protesters pop up and almost clean up after themselves instantaneously, and it was quite fascinating. And at night time when I was watching the TV, I was surprised at the violence that I was seeing on the TV because you didn't actually see it on the streets. But I did feel very unnerved when I saw some of the police trotting around with machine guns. I mean, that did unnerve me a bit. And when I'd gone to film The Peak, because it's part of the book, and I was also tried to film in front of the former governor's mansion, and the police, I mean, if there wasn't 500 police around this 2-acre block of land, I'll go here. It was, so the police were very serious, very intent on squashing the protest. My feeling is that I think, you know, 18 months, 2 years, I reckon mainland Chinese will be marching in. I can't see it sorting itself out. I just think it's too frayed. You know, the democratic requirements versus what you can see the mainland Chinese want out of it. I can't see a sensible resolution.
Mainland China benefits a lot from Hong Kong. The raise US, it's a offshore capital raising centre for mainland China. So it is in their interest to keep that going, but they don't want You know, they want it to be kind of in their box, a useful tool for their own interest. I think is broadly how they'd see things. I don't know. I mean, it might come to that. Like if there's bloodshed on the streets, you know, God knows, you know, and there needed to be a heavy hand to restore order, maybe that would happen. But we're not there yet. And I don't think they want to sort of bluster and do their parades in Shenzhen as a bit of an indication to sort of make people aware that it's serious. But I think it would take a lot yet before. And I don't even think
we probably should call it. Yeah, questions. People can talk to you afterwards. We've still got more wine here. So.
7 o'clock.
And there's the what do you call it? Lord of the Rings, but Liberty on the Rock. There's a little bit of confusion there, I'm sure.